In 1962, the Greenbrier stood at the height of its post-war splendor, a mountain resort where presidents, diplomats, and industrial families disappeared into comfort. Beneath its newest wing, however, 100 metal beds waited behind blast doors for all 535 members of Congress. The facility remained ready for 30 years. Then one investigation destroyed the secrecy that protected it. This is how a luxury hotel became part of America's plan to survive nuclear war. Before there was a Greenbrier hotel, there was a spring. It rose from the floor of a narrow Allegheny valley at a steady temperature, carrying minerals that gave the water its pale appearance and unmistakable sulfur odor. To modern visitors, it may seem an unlikely foundation for one of America's great resorts. To people living before modern medicine, however, mineral springs offered something more valuable than scenery. They offered the possibility that the natural world might restore what illness, age, and climate had taken away. The year 1778 is often presented as the beginning of the Greenbrier, but no grand hotel opened that year. Later histories identify a woman named Mrs. Anderson as an early visitor who came seeking relief from rheumatism. Whether every detail of that account can be recovered is less important than what the date represents. By the late 18th century, White Sulphur Spring had begun to acquire a reputation as a place where people traveled not merely to rest, but to be made well. Reaching it was initially part of the ordeal. The surrounding mountains protected the valley from the noise and heat of the eastern cities, but they also left it isolated. The opening of the state road in 1790 brought more travelers across the region. The James River and Kanawha Turnpike, completed through the area in 1824, connected the spring more directly with eastern Virginia, the Kanawha Valley, and routes toward the Ohio River. Each improvement shortened the psychological distance between the wilderness and the drawing rooms of the South. Architecture followed the roads. Paradise Row, built around 1800, provided some of the first organized guest accommodations. A two-story tavern appeared in 1809. In 1816, Stephen Henderson, a wealthy New Orleans sugar planter, built the large federal-style residence now called the President's Cottage. Its later name came from the prominent political figures who stayed there, among them Martin Van Buren, John Tyler, and Millard Fillmore. Long before Washington considered hiding Congress at the Greenbrier, American political power had already learned the way to White Sulphur Springs. During the 1820s and 1830s, the settlement became a composed resort landscape. South Carolina Row, Alabama Row, and other groups of cottages spread around the spring. Baltimore lawyer John H.B. Latrobe, the son of Capitol architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe, helped develop the Baltimore Row cottages. Their broad porches, hipped roofs, and measured columns offered shade while allowing mountain air to move through the rooms. The buildings did not overwhelm the valley. They arranged it, turning open ground, water, and paths into a place that appeared both natural and controlled. The spring house gave that promise its clearest form. Built in the 1830s, its circular roof rested on 12 columns above the water. A statue of Hygeia, the classical goddess of health, once stood above it. The design translated a physical spring into a public symbol. Guests did not simply approach a pool of mineral water. They entered a small temple devoted to health, youth, and renewal. The architecture lent dignity to treatments whose medical value was praised by 19th-century physicians, but could not be demonstrated by the standards used today. The resort offered another kind of relief as well. Wealthy families escaped the summer heat and disease associated with lower elevations. They rode horses, attended dances, arranged courtships, discussed politics, and displayed their position among social equals. The cottages allowed private family life to exist beside a highly organized public season. White Sulphur Springs promised temporary separation from ordinary obligations, without requiring its guests to surrender status or comfort. That promise was never available equally. The National Historic Landmark Record describes the resort as a destination created for wealthy Southerners, including planters and slaveholders. Much of the wealth displayed in its cottages had been produced within a slaveholding economy. The surviving histories say far more about presidents, planters, and visiting belles than about the people who cooked meals, tended rooms, maintained the baths, carried baggage, and cared for horses. The elegance of White Sulphur Springs was real, but so was the social order that made it possible. By the 1850s, the cottage settlement was no longer large enough for the ambitions of its owners. A group of Virginia investors purchased the property in 1857 and began constructing a hotel approximately 400 feet long and 100 feet wide. When the Grand Central Hotel opened in June 1858, it contained 228 guest chambers. Its dining room could seat roughly 1,200 people, while a ballroom stood at one end and an immense parlor at the other. Guests soon preferred a simpler name. They called it the White. The new building was intended to prove that the South could create a resort equal to those of the North. It gathered health, architecture, wealth, and regional identity beneath one roof. Yet its timing gave that confidence a harder meaning. Sectional hostility was intensifying, and slave-holding guests increasingly regarded northern resorts as politically unwelcome. The White became more than a hotel. It became a statement about Southern independence. For nearly 80 years, White Sulphur Springs had grown by offering refuge from heat, illness, and isolation. In 1858, that promise reached its grandest architectural form. Less than 3 years later, the country would be at war, and the hotel built to shelter leisure would be asked to shelter soldiers. The Grand Central Hotel had been built to celebrate Southern confidence, but it opened as that confidence was becoming political defiance. During the final years before the Civil War, influential families gathered at White Sulphur Springs for dinners, dances, and conversation. Secessionists recognized the value of reaching powerful men away from legislatures and offices. Edmund Ruffin, one of the South's most committed advocates of disunion, came seeking support. By 1860, the White had added a pistol gallery, women formed shooting clubs, and even children drilled on the lawns. When war came in 1861, the resort could no longer pretend that the mountains separated it from national events. Armies moved through western Virginia, and control of the property shifted with them. The hotel and cottages served as barracks and hospitals for Confederate and Union forces. Rooms intended for wealthy summer guests held sick and wounded soldiers. Furniture and other contents disappeared or were destroyed. Union troops came close to burning the complex, leaving a monument to Southern permanence damaged and uncertain of survival. The White reopened after the war because its owners understood that the property could not live entirely in the past. Repairs began, social seasons resumed, and former patrons returned. Robert E. Lee visited in 1867 and 1868, becoming the most visible figure in the resort's attempt to turn reunion into a social performance. He encouraged Southern guests to show courtesy toward Northerners and joined other former Confederates in signing what became known as the White Sulphur Manifesto, supporting renewed political and commercial relations between the regions. The reconciliation was incomplete. Many guests wanted peace without surrendering the assumptions of the society that had existed before emancipation. Lee's presence also helped transform the White into a setting where the Confederacy could be remembered through dignity and nostalgia rather than slavery and secession. Northern politicians arrived to court Southern influence, while former Confederate families returned to recover part of their former social world. The resort survived, but survival required it to soften the meaning of its own past. A more lasting change arrived on steel rails. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway reached White Sulphur Springs by 1869, with connections expanding in the following year. Travelers who had once endured mountain roads could now arrive near the hotel in private railroad cars. The railway brought industrialists, financiers, and northern visitors alongside the traditional Southern clientele. It also tied the property's future to a corporation capable of supplying capital and national transportation. In 1910, the Chesapeake and Ohio purchased the resort. The company hired New York architect Frederick Junius Sterner to design a new hotel beside the aging Grand Central. Completed in 1913, the 7-story Greenbrier contained approximately 250 bedrooms and large public rooms behind a balanced Georgian Revival facade. A 2-story colonnade supported taller columns and a central pediment, giving the building the appearance of an established institution rather than a seasonal collection of cottages. The new Greenbrier changed the promise of the property. White Sulphur Springs had been a summer retreat centered on mineral water. The Railway Hotel offered year-round service, modern plumbing, formal dining, golf, and direct connections to the wider country. Vanderbilts, Armours, political leaders, and international guests arrived with a different understanding of luxury. The old White remained beside it until failing a fire inspection and being demolished in 1922. Later additions allowed the newer building to absorb the identity of the entire resort. That ability to assume new identities became essential after Pearl Harbor. Within days of the attack in December 1941, the United States government leased the Greenbrier as an internment center for German, Italian, and Japanese diplomats and their families. They were not ordinary prisoners of war. American officials hoped that relatively comfortable treatment would encourage Axis governments to protect American diplomats held overseas. For approximately 7 months, a hotel created to welcome international elites confined foreign representatives while governments negotiated exchanges. The diplomats departed in the summer of 1942, but the resort did not return to civilian life. In September, the Army purchased the hotel and roughly 7,000 surrounding acres from the Chesapeake in Ohio for $3.3 million. Workers converted guest rooms into wards. On November 14, the first patients entered Ashford General Hospital, named for Army physician Bailey K. Ashford. The complex had approximately 2,025 beds and developed specialties in neurology, neurosurgery, and vascular surgery. Between 1942 and 1946, Ashford treated 24,148 service members. General Omar Bradley and Dwight D. Eisenhower were among its patients, but most who passed through its rooms were soldiers recovering without public recognition. More than 500 civilians worked at the hospital. From 1943 to 1945, approximately 1,000 German prisoners of war, housed at nearby Camp Ashford, helped maintain the buildings and grounds during a labor shortage. Golf courses and baths once reserved for guests became part of military rehabilitation. When the hospital closed in 1946, the building carried 4 years of institutional use inside rooms designed for privilege. The Chesapeake in Ohio regained the property and hired Dorothy Draper to direct its transformation. Draper did not make the hospital disappear through restraint. She used floral wallpapers, strong colors, oversized patterns, and carefully arranged public rooms to restore confidence through abundance. By the spring of 1948, the Greenbrier had returned to luxury. Yet the restoration did not erase what the government had learned. The resort could be emptied, purchased, reorganized, supplied, and operated as a national facility. Its bedrooms could become wards, its ballrooms could serve military purposes, and its private landscape could be closed to the public. Within another decade, Washington would ask the Greenbrier to change identities once more. This time, almost no one was supposed to know. When the Greenbrier reopened in 1948, it returned to a role for which its history had prepared it. Presidents, military officers, diplomats, corporate leaders, and members of Congress could meet there without appearing to enter a government building. Dorothy Draper's interiors provided ceremony without Washington formality. Golf courses, dining rooms, and private parlors allowed consequential conversations to occur within the rituals of a luxury resort. The Greenbrier did not merely attract power. It made power appear to be at leisure. The federal government continued to use that quality. In 1949, Secretary of Defense Louis Johnson met there with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretaries of the Army, Navy, and Air Force to discuss post-war military strategy. In March 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower welcomed Canadian Prime Minister Louis St. Laurent and Mexican President Adolfo Ruiz Cortines to the Greenbrier. The meeting showed that the hotel could function as a temporary diplomatic capital while remaining a private destination. Behind such gatherings stood a new national anxiety. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic weapon in 1949. Within a few years, both superpowers possessed hydrogen bombs capable of destroying cities on a scale that made older defense plans inadequate. Washington was an obvious target whose destruction might remove the officials, records, communication systems, and institutions needed to direct the country afterward. The federal response included a network of emergency installations. Mount Weather in Virginia was developed as a relocation center for civilian agencies and executive leadership. Raven Rock, near the Maryland-Pennsylvania border, provided protected command facilities for the military. These sites belonged to a larger idea called continuity of government. The nation had to prepare not only to fight a war, but to preserve lawful authority after an attack. Congress created a different problem. Executive agencies could prepare alternate command posts through established chains of authority. The House and Senate were deliberative bodies whose legitimacy depended upon elected members gathering, debating, voting, and representing separate states and districts. If Congress were destroyed while the executive survived, the country might retain a commander-in-chief but lose the institution responsible for legislation, appropriations, oversight, and consent. Preserving individuals would not be enough. Planners had to preserve a working legislature. In 1955, Eisenhower directed the Department of Defense to develop emergency arrangements for Congress. Much of what followed remained classified, and the public record does not reveal every discussion or participant. The clearest documentary link appeared the following year. On March 28, 1956, 4 congressional leaders sent a short letter to Walter J. Tuohy, president of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. It introduced George Stewart, the architect of the Capitol, who would call upon him concerning matters of vital importance to Congress. The letter did not describe a shelter or mention nuclear war. Stewart was an unusual messenger. Despite his title, he was not a practicing architect. He was a former congressman and civil engineer whose office managed the Capitol complex and understood the physical requirements of the legislative branch. His involvement indicated that the facility would need more than beds and supplies. It required spaces in which the House and Senate could continue to act like the House and Senate. The Greenbrier offered several advantages. It stood approximately 250 miles from Washington, distant enough to hope it might escape an attack on the Capitol, but close enough to reach if officials received sufficient warning. Roads and the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway connected it to Washington, while a nearby airport offered another route. The mountains reduced casual observation, and the large property allowed construction and deliveries away from population centers. Its history was equally important. The government had leased and purchased the property during World War II. Eisenhower had been treated there as a soldier and returned as president. Military planners and congressional groups knew its rooms. The Chesapeake and Ohio conducted extensive federal business and possessed the resources to manage a large project without advertising its purpose. The social structure around the resort also favored secrecy. The Greenbrier was one of the county's most important employers, and many families had worked there across generations. That dependence did not mean every employee knew the plan or remained silent for the same reason. Some felt loyalty to the hotel, some respected government authority, and others understood that questions could threaten stable employment. A secret placed inside the Greenbrier could be protected partly by institutional habit. The proposed facility passed through several names. Early references used Project X, followed by Project Casper. During the 1980s, the operation became known as Project Greek Island, the name now most closely associated with the bunker. The changing labels separated phases of a program whose location was never supposed to enter public discussion. By 1957, the Greenbrier was preparing to announce another expansion. Plans called for guest rooms, meeting spaces, an exhibition hall, and indoor recreation in a West Virginia wing. Nothing about that program seemed implausible for a resort entering the post-war convention business. That was precisely its value. The hotel would build a public addition large enough to explain the excavation, workers, concrete, and equipment arriving on the property. Beneath it, Congress would construct something the guests above were never meant to see. The secret beneath the Greenbrier was not protected by making construction invisible. A project of its size could not be hidden from the people digging earth, driving trucks, and pouring concrete. Instead, the government gave the activity a public explanation. The resort was building a new wing for the convention trade. Every load of material could appear to belong to a hotel improvement. The dates vary because sources measure different stages of the work. Planning and the public cover developed during 1957 and 1958. Major excavation began around 1959, followed by construction through 1961. The relocation facility reached operational readiness in 1962. The underground structure had to be placed inside the hill before the finished West Virginia wing made the disturbed landscape appear normal again. Workers used a method known as cut and cover. Rather than tunneling deep through solid rock, excavation equipment removed part of the hillside and opened an enormous cavity. Crews built the reinforced concrete facility inside, covered it with a heavy roof, and returned soil above it. Depending upon the location, approximately 20 to 60 feet of earth separated the bunker from the structures and landscape overhead. This corrects one of the most persistent claims about the site. The facility was not buried 720 feet below the surface. It extended roughly 720 feet into the hillside. That distinction was central to its limitations. Mount Weather and Raven Rock relied heavily upon the mountains around them. The Greenbrier facility depended upon reinforced concrete, distance from Washington, and secrecy. It was protected against fallout and the effects of a nuclear explosion roughly 15 to 30 miles away, not a direct strike. The finished complex occupied 112,544 square feet on 2 levels. Its 153 rooms included dormitories, medical spaces, storage areas, offices, communications facilities, and machinery to support approximately 100 people. Above it, the West Virginia wing offered 88 new guest rooms and public meeting areas. One project had created 2 buildings, one intended to attract attention as a resort expansion, and another whose value depended upon remaining unknown. The completed wing was both the camouflage and an operational part of the shelter. For Randy Wickline, the distinction between those buildings became difficult to believe. Wickline drove concrete for Superior Supply Company, a local business working on the project. He later remembered an unusual urgency surrounding the job. His company purchased additional mixer trucks and maintained a pace that sometimes pushed legal weight limits. Over roughly 2.5 years, he estimated that its drivers made about 4,000 deliveries and poured close to 50,000 tons of concrete into the excavation. Those numbers came from Wickline's recollection rather than a final government report. A convention wing required dations. This project consumed material on another scale. High fences restricted the view, guards controlled access, and workers encountered walls several feet thick. One contractor reportedly looked at the 110 urinals installed for the supposed exhibition area and asked what kind of exhibit could require them. The clearest evidence arrived by rail. In February 1960, Mosler Safe Company of Ohio received an order for 4 blast doors under the unremarkable description of additional facilities for the Greenbrier Hotel. Mosler had developed expertise in doors intended to survive pressures created by atomic explosions. Its records referred to the 2 largest Greenbrier doors as GH1 and GH3. GH1, including its frame and assembly, weighed more than 28 tons. It measured more than 12 feet wide and 15 feet high. GH3 weighed more than 20 tons. Each was approximately 19.5 inches thick and hung on hinges weighing about 1.5 tons. Yet careful balancing allowed the doors to move with approximately 50 pounds of applied force. Once closed, internal mechanisms secured them against the pressure and rebound of a blast. Moving the doors from Ohio required special rail cars positioned low enough to pass through tunnels along the route. Their arrival could not be invisible. What remained hidden was their purpose. 2 doors protected vehicle entrances. A smaller hatch and a personnel door sealed the other access points. Concrete added after installation turned the openings into parts of a hardened enclosure. Rumors spread through White Sulphur Springs. Many residents concluded that the government was building a bomb shelter, but the most common version placed the president inside it. In 1959, when the Charleston Gazette asked whether the Greenbrier was constructing a presidential shelter, a hotel executive denied knowing of such a project. The answer could be literally accurate. The facility was not intended for the president. It was intended for Congress. That misunderstanding served the project better than complete disbelief. Residents could recognize a government installation without identifying the institution it was built to preserve. Randy Wickline understood the inequality more directly. The space might hold national leaders, but there was no comparable refuge for the people carrying concrete into the hill or for their families nearby. The men making the bunker possible were also among those expected to remain outside it. By 1962, the excavation had been covered, the public rooms finished, and the West Virginia wing opened to guests. Visitors slept in new bedrooms, attended meetings, and entered an exhibition hall whose strength could be explained as support for heavy commercial displays. The hillside once again looked composed. Beneath it, behind doors that could close in a moment, another House chamber, another Senate chamber, and the machinery of a second Capitol were waiting. The bunker beneath the Greenbrier was designed around a question no American institution had previously been forced to answer in physical form. If Washington disappeared, what would Congress require in order to remain Congress? The planners' answer was not a single shelter room filled with emergency supplies. They attempted to reproduce the essential spaces of the legislative branch, then surround them with the systems needed to keep more than 1,000 people alive. The largest of those spaces was hidden in public. The exhibit hall measured approximately 89 feet by 186 feet beneath a ceiling nearly 20 feet high. 18 heavy columns supported the structure above. To hotel guests, its reinforced floor made it suitable for trade shows, automobiles, and industrial displays. Under emergency conditions, blast doors could seal the hall inside the protected facility, converting a commercial exhibition space into a chamber for joint sessions of Congress. 2 auditoriums stood nearby. Governor's Hall was arranged to accommodate the House of Representatives. Sources describe its capacity as approximately 440 to 470 seats, a difference likely reflecting changing configurations, rather than a dispute about its purpose. The smaller Mountaineer Room held roughly 130 people and was intended for the Senate. Chairs faced stages in spaces that could support debate, announcements, and formal proceedings. Above ground, they were meeting rooms. After an attack, they would become substitutes for the chambers inside the Capitol. Living conditions were less ceremonial. 18 dormitories were designed for approximately 60 people each, bringing the planned capacity close to 100. Rows of metal bunk beds replaced the private offices, homes, and social distinctions familiar to legislators in Washington. Beds could be assigned as elections changed the membership of Congress, but there were no private suites for individual senators or representatives. The arrangement treated survival as a collective military problem rather than an extension of resort life. Anyone arriving after exposure to fallout would first pass through decontamination. At the western entrance, the system could process approximately 150 people per hour. A larger area near the exhibit hall could handle about 240. Occupants would remove their clothing, move through showers, and receive clean underwear and coveralls before entering the protected interior. The procedure reduced the danger of carrying radioactive material inside, But it also marked the psychological threshold between the world that had existed before the blast and the enclosed society beyond the doors. Food was organized on an institutional scale. A cafeteria could seat about 400 people at one time, requiring occupants to eat in shifts. Its walls included false windows with painted country scenes, an attempt to ease the effects of prolonged confinement. The kitchen and storage areas maintained roughly 60 days of provisions. Supplies changed over time as sea rations gave way to freeze-dried food and later military meals, but the problem remained constant. Everything had an expiration date and had to be replaced even though the emergency might never come. Water, fuel, air, and electricity determined how long the facility could function. 3 tanks held 25,000 gallons of water each, supported by purification equipment. 3 additional tanks stored 14,000 gallons of diesel fuel apiece. Generators, chillers, pumps, boilers, and air compressors occupied a power plant extending across several levels. The sealed bunker carried enough internal air for an initial period, commonly described as about 72 hours, after which its filtration system would have to draw air from outside. The power systems were designed for weeks, not permanent underground life. The medical section anticipated illness, injury, and death. It included an infirmary, an operating room, dental equipment, and a pharmacy. Planners could stock medications and replace them as they expired, but they could not assume that every specialist needed after an attack would reach the bunker. In the power area stood an incinerator intended for refuse and pathological waste. Once the blast doors were sealed, ordinary burial would be impossible. If an occupant died, the same machinery used to dispose of contaminated waste could be used for cremation. Communication was as important as physical survival. Radio rooms, telephone systems, recording booths, cryptographic equipment, and a television studio were prepared to connect the hidden Congress with surviving officials and the public. A backdrop representing the Capitol could be placed behind speakers appearing on camera. The image was meant to suggest continuity even if the building it depicted no longer existed. Architecture would provide a temporary government, while broadcasting would provide the appearance of national order. The Congressional Record Room held materials needed to preserve institutional memory. Leadership offices provided separate working space for those responsible for organizing the House and Senate. Together with the chambers, these rooms showed that planners understood Congress as more than 535 living bodies. It depended upon records, procedure, communication, and recognizable forms. The bunker attempted to preserve those forms by building a compressed capital inside a West Virginia hillside, yet its greatest weaknesses were visible in what it did not contain. Space for congressional staff was limited, although specialists, clerks, parliamentarians, technicians, and medical personnel would be essential. Plans for coordination with the president were incomplete. Most strikingly, the dormitories had no room for the spouses and children of the people expected to occupy them. The bunker could produce electricity, filter air, store water, and resist blast pressure. It could provide stages on which the House and Senate might reassemble. What it could not guarantee was that members would reach the Greenbrier in time, accept separation from their families, or retain the authority to speak for a country transformed beyond recognition. Building a Congress underground had been the easier task. Persuading Congress to enter it would be another problem entirely. Once the bunker became operational, secrecy depended less upon concrete than routine. Machinery had to run, supplies had to remain usable, and communications systems had to keep pace with technology. Yet federal technicians entering a restricted area beneath the hotel would have invited questions. The solution was Forsyth Associates, an apparently ordinary company whose employees provided television and audio-visual services to the Greenbrier. The cover worked because the business was real. Forsyth employees repaired television sets, delivered equipment to guest rooms, maintained cable service, and supported meetings. Guests saw technicians performing work that matched the name on their uniforms and vehicles. Behind that service stood another responsibility: The same employees could enter secured spaces, inspect government equipment, and maintain the bunker without appearing out of place. Their most secret tasks survived by sharing space with their most visible one. Sources disagree about the permanent staff. Contemporary reporting described 6 or 7 full-time employees, while later accounts placed the number between 12 and 15. The difference may reflect changes over 3 decades or variations in who was counted. The installation relied upon a small group whose ordinary presence concealed specialized federal work. The first manager was John Lundice, a former Army Signal Corps cryptographic specialist who had held a top-secret clearance and worked at the Pentagon. He arrived in 1960 as construction continued. When questioned in 1992, Lundice maintained that his work involved only television service. Paul Fritz Bugus succeeded him after Lundice retired in 1976. Bugus later estimated that television work occupied about 1/5 of the staff's time. Maintaining the government facility consumed the rest. That maintenance was repetitive and exacting. Food had to be removed before it spoiled and replaced. Medicines expired more quickly and required careful rotation. Air filters, pumps, generators, communications equipment, and water systems had to be inspected. Diesel engines were run regularly, even though they had never powered an occupied shelter. Readiness was not a condition achieved in 1962 and preserved untouched. It had to be renewed every week. The people for whom the bunker waited also changed. Elections brought new representatives and senators, while others retired, lost office, or died. Bed assignments and occupancy records had to follow those changes. For approximately 30 years, the dormitories remained prepared for people who did not know they had assigned places inside them. The empty bunks represented both an emergency plan and thousands of hours spent preparing for an arrival that never occurred. The exhibit hall and auditoriums could not remain vacant without weakening the cover, so they stayed part of the hotel. Corporations installed product displays and drove automobiles across floors intended for a joint session of Congress. Guests attended conventions in the planned House and Senate chambers. Employees used parts of the area for recreation, and children gathered there for holiday programs. Normal use did not interfere with the disguise, it completed it. Physical barriers were made to look unremarkable. A blast door near a public area disappeared behind a false wall and decoration. Another route ended at a secured door warning of high voltage. Pipes, vents, locks, and service corridors belonged naturally inside a hotel. The secret survived because guests had no reason to inspect them. A familiar warning sign often protected the bunker more effectively than a visible guard. White Sulphur Springs was less easily persuaded. Residents remembered the excavation, unusual quantities of concrete, and enormous doors delivered during construction. Some knew workers who entered restricted areas. Others had heard that Forsyth maintained more than televisions. The existence of some kind of government installation became an open secret, although its purpose remained uncertain. The community's silence cannot be reduced to one motive. The Greenbrier provided stable work in an area with limited alternatives, and generations of families had built their lives around it. Some residents feared risking employment. Others regarded discretion as patriotic. There was also pride in knowing their town held something important. Habit eventually did what formal secrecy could not. People learned which questions were not asked publicly. One account suggests how much the government understood about local knowledge. According to an anonymous former official, 2 men were sent to the area posing as hunters so they could listen to residents. They reportedly returned with enough information that they required security clearances. No public document independently confirms the episode, but it captures the strange boundary around the Greenbrier. The secret was widely suspected, without being publicly established. The bunker came closest to its intended purpose during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. Former officials said the facility went on high alert at Kenishan. Lundice reportedly maintained his ordinary departure time to avoid attention, then returned after dark. Supplies and government materials were readied, but Congress was not evacuated. The blast doors remained open, and hotel life continued above. That pattern defined the next 3 decades. Forsyth employees prepared the bunker as if activation might come tomorrow, while guests behaved as if nothing existed below. The arrangement endured because machinery, workers, hotel routines, and community silence supported the same illusion. By the end of the Cold War, however, maintaining readiness had become easier than answering whether the original plan could still work. The Greenbrier bunker was an impressive answer to a particular version of nuclear war. Its weakness was that the version kept changing. The facility assumed leaders would recognize a crisis before missiles were launched, and that Congress could be assembled and moved from Washington. If those assumptions failed, the blast doors, food stores, and legislative chambers would wait for occupants who could never arrive. The first problem was distance. The Greenbrier stood approximately 250 miles from the capital, about 5 hours by road under ordinary conditions. A flight could take roughly an hour, excluding the time needed to locate 535 legislators, move them to an airport, load aircraft, and coordinate their arrival. Members were rarely gathered in one place outside formal sessions. Some would be at offices, homes, airports, hearings, or events across the country. The plan therefore required advance warning. In the 1950s, planners could imagine Soviet bombers taking hours to cross the polar region. A worsening crisis might provide a day or more for a quiet relocation. As missile technology improved, that interval contracted. An intercontinental ballistic missile could arrive in well under an hour, while submarine-launched weapons could reduce warning to less than 15 minutes. A shelter 5 hours away belonged to an earlier clock. Most members would not have understood an evacuation order. Only congressional leadership received full briefings about the Greenbrier. The secrecy protecting the site prevented ordinary representatives and senators from learning the route, procedures, or destination. Officials would have needed to reveal the plan, authenticate the order, gather the members, and begin movement without disclosing the destination to anyone watching. The larger the evacuation became, the more visible it would be. The nearby airport offered only a partial solution. In 1962, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway and the Greenbrier helped finance an extension of its runway, allowing larger aircraft to land. The improvement supported resort business and made an emergency airlift more conceivable. It did not provide aircraft guarantee that Washington airports would remain open, or explain how hundreds of legislators could leave without directing attention toward the shelter. No full congressional evacuation was ever attempted, so the assumptions remained untested. A plan that worked on paper never had to move hundreds of reluctant people under actual pressure. Family was a deeper obstacle. Former House Speaker Tip O'Neill recalled receiving annual briefings about the bunker, but taking little interest after learning that his wife could not accompany him. His response exposed more than personal reluctance. The plan assumed elected officials would abandon spouses and children when those families faced the greatest danger. Compliance might mean permanent separation. Richard Arenberg confronted the same problem while working for Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell in the early 1990s. After touring the facility, Arenberg concluded that the lack of space for spouses and children came close to being a fatal flaw. The bunker also had limited capacity for staff. Congress depended upon clerks, policy specialists, technicians, security officers, medical personnel, and parliamentarians who might not be included. The leadership presented a constitutional complication. The Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate stood in the presidential line of succession. During an attack, security officials might remove them to protected executive location rather than send them to the Greenbrier. That would separate congressional leaders from the institution they were expected to organize. Plans for communicating with the surviving president were also less developed than the equipment suggested. Planners had filled a library with novels and preserved congressional materials, but Arenberg found important gaps. A legislature required the congressional record, procedural precedents, legal references, voting systems, and people who knew how to use them. A chamber filled with surviving members would not automatically produce an operating Congress. The building reproduced the visible forms of government more completely than the knowledge and relationships that made them work. Physical protection had limits. The bunker was intended to withstand fallout and the effects of a nuclear explosion roughly 15 to 30 miles away. It was not built to survive a direct strike. Unlike facilities buried within massive mountains, it relied heavily upon remaining unidentified. Once an enemy knew its location, additional concrete could not restore the protection secrecy had provided. The contrast with civilian planning was difficult to avoid. As late as 1990, federal plans directed approximately 45,500 residents of Fairfax County, Virginia, toward Greenbrier County during a nuclear emergency. No comparable shelter waited for them. Families were expected to bring vehicles or tents, food, medicine, and other supplies, then occupy hills, valleys, and pasture land. Officials would have reinforced doors and filtered air. Civilians arriving in the same county would have open ground. That inequality does not make continuity of Congress unnecessary. A surviving president without a legislature would concentrate authority when constitutional restraint mattered most. Preserving Congress could protect representative government rather than merely politicians. The failure was more precise. Planners devoted extraordinary care to preserving offices and procedures without resolving how the people inside would continue to represent those left outside. By the early 1990s, officials were examining these weaknesses and considering alternatives. The Greenbrier remained maintained because it was relatively inexpensive to keep ready and might still serve during a chemical attack or temporary relocation. Yet the original nuclear plan had become difficult to defend. While people inside government debated its future in secret, a journalist was assembling the evidence that would force the debate into public view. By the early 1990s, the Greenbrier bunker existed in an unusual condition. Hundreds of local residents suspected it, former officials questioned whether it still served its purpose, and a small federal staff continued to maintain it. Yet the public had no official confirmation that Congress possessed a hidden relocation center beneath a private resort. The difference between rumor and established fact remained the secrecy on which the facility depended. Journalist Ted Gupp began with information from a source whose identity has never been publicly established. A tip alone could not support a story involving national security, congressional leadership, and one of the country's best-known resorts. Gupp spent months reconstructing the installation through people and documents. He interviewed construction workers, former hotel employees, contractors, local officials, and individuals familiar with federal continuity planning. The physical evidence provided a separate line of confirmation. Private blueprints and photographs showed spaces inconsistent with an ordinary hotel addition. Mosler Safe Company records documented 4 specially designed blast doors ordered for the Greenbrier in 1960. Contractors remembered the volume of concrete, reinforced walls, guarded work areas, and unusual fixtures. Each source knew only part of the project, but together their accounts described a facility designed for Congress. The investigation also revealed how effectively ordinary hotel space had concealed the plan. The exhibit hall and 2 auditoriums were open to guests, although they could be sealed inside the bunker. Gupp walked through these areas with Greenbrier president Ted Kleisner, who rejected the suggestion that a government installation existed beneath the resort. When they approached the secured doorway leading toward the hidden section, Kleisner described it as an equipment area and refused to open it. The denial preserved a secrecy agreement, but it also demonstrated why independent confirmation mattered. CSX, the corporate successor to the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, publicly stated that no government facility existed. Some former managers said they could not discuss the subject because of obligations they had accepted. Others acknowledged knowing that something government-related occupied the hillside, while insisting they had never asked for details. The institution survived through carefully limited knowledge as much as direct falsehood. Publication brought its own complications. The Washington Times reported the bunker's existence on May 29, 1992. 2 days later, the Washington Post magazine published Gupp's detailed investigation, The Ultimate Congressional Hideaway. The article did more than announce that a shelter existed. It identified its legislative purpose, described its chambers and support systems, named Forsyth Associates, examined the evacuation problem, and questioned whether secrecy had allowed an outdated plan to escape review. Congressional leaders responded that publication had compromised the facility's security and might force the program to end. Their objection rested upon a fact Gupp's reporting had already established. The Greenbrier could not survive a direct nuclear strike and relied heavily upon remaining unidentified. Once the location became national news, a central layer of protection disappeared. The dispute cannot be reduced to a choice between courageous journalism and government deception. Congress had a legitimate need for an emergency meeting place, and revealing a usable facility could impose real costs. The press also had reason to question a publicly funded program maintained after the Cold War without open scrutiny. Secrecy protected the bunker from attack, but it also protected its assumptions, expenditures, and weaknesses from democratic examination. Gupp later argued that the facility had already become obsolete. It was conceived when planners expected enough warning to move Congress hundreds of miles from Washington. By 1992, missile technology had shortened that warning dramatically, while the problems involving families, staff, transportation, and executive coordination remained unresolved. Those who maintained the site answered that an imperfect shelter could still serve during chemical attack, terrorism, or another emergency that made the capital temporarily unusable. The people of White Sulphur Springs experienced the publication differently. Many were not surprised that a government installation existed. The greater revelation was that it had been intended for Congress rather than the president. Some residents felt pride that their community had protected a national secret for 3 decades. Others regarded the reporter as an outsider who had exposed something the town had been trusted to keep. The government moved quickly after publication. The facility began to be phased out, and equipment, supplies, records, and most furnishings were transferred to other government locations. The process was not completed in a single day. Maintenance and removal continued while officials ended the program, and the federal lease formally terminated in July 1995. What had been a congressional refuge now belonged entirely to the history of the resort. The first groups invited inside included Greenbrier employees, a quiet acknowledgement of the community that had worked around the secret without publicly confirming it. Guest tours began in 1995. Rooms once prepared for the destruction of Washington became spaces where visitors could examine how the government had imagined survival. The bunker had lost its operational value because it could finally be seen, yet visibility gave the building a different public purpose. The question was no longer whether the Greenbrier could keep the facility hidden. It was whether the resort could reveal it without turning the Cold War, the workers who sustained it, and the people left outside its doors into nothing more than an attraction. The Greenbrier bunker lost its official purpose when it became public, but exposure gave it a second chance to survive. Equipment and most furnishings were removed as the government withdrew. The concrete rooms remained, joined permanently to a resort that could no longer deny their existence. In 1995, the Greenbrier began taking guests through the former relocation center. Tours opened to the general public in 2006, transforming a classified facility into a place where Cold War planning could be examined. Visitors today enter on tours lasting approximately 90 minutes. The power plant, kitchen, dining room, governor's hall, mountaineer room, and portions of the communications complex retain important original features. Other spaces were reconstructed after federal equipment had been reassigned. A restored dormitory, medical area, leadership quarters, and records room help explain the facility, but they are interpretations rather than untouched time capsules. The Greenbrier was already nationally recognized before the bunker was revealed. The resort entered the National Register of Historic Places in 1974 and became a National Historic Landmark in 1990. Its landmark documentation celebrated the mineral springs, cottage rows, gardens, golf courses, and main hotel. The period of significance ended around 1940. The West Virginia wing appeared in the physical inventory, but its Cold War purpose could not be acknowledged. This created a gap in official memory. One of the most consequential chapters in the property's 20th century history was absent from the document, recognizing its national importance. The nomination preserved the story the Greenbrier could tell publicly: health, recreation, architecture, presidents, and Southern hospitality. Beneath those recognized spaces stood another national institution, maintained at public expense yet missing from the account. Opening the bunker protected that history from disappearing. Its dormitories show how little privacy legislators would have possessed. The blast doors demonstrate both the ambition and limits of the engineering. The false windows, medical rooms, and incinerator reveal how planners imagined prolonged confinement. The physical spaces allow visitors to encounter decisions that documents can make seem abstract. Tourism can also narrow the meaning of the place. Secret doors, metal bunks, hidden passages, and presidential rumors make effective attractions. They can turn the bunker into an architectural puzzle instead of a political decision. If the story ends with the cleverness of hiding a shelter beneath a hotel, it avoids harder questions about who was protected, who was excluded, and whether the facility could preserve representative government rather than merely its office holders. Workers belong at the center of that interpretation. Local drivers carried thousands of loads of concrete into the hill. Construction crews installed machinery and doors for a purpose they could not discuss. Forsyth employees spent 3 decades rotating food, replacing medicine, testing generators, and updating equipment for occupants who never arrived. Residents of White Sulphur Springs lived beside an open secret without receiving a place inside it. Their labor made continuity possible, while their exclusion revealed its boundaries. The bunker's policy history did not end when the government left. After September 11, Congress examined how it could operate if the Capitol became inaccessible or large numbers of members were killed or incapacitated. In a hearing on electronic government, witnesses invoked the Greenbrier as an example of planning built around an older threat model. The bunker assumed enough warning to gather Congress and move it hundreds of miles. A sudden attack exposed the weakness of relying upon one protected destination. The question returned during the COVID-19 pandemic. In a 2020 Senate discussion about continuity and remote voting, lawmakers again referred to the underground facility at the Greenbrier. This time, the danger was not a destroyed Capitol, but a legislature whose members could not safely gather. The bunker had protected Congress by concentrating people. The pandemic suggested that Congress might survive only by remaining dispersed. The original planners asked where Congress could hide. Later debates asked how Congress could debate, vote, communicate, and represent the public when physical assembly became impossible. Continuity depended upon preserving constitutional legitimacy, not merely a chamber and enough beds. The bunker should therefore be remembered neither as a complete success nor as a pointless failure. Its engineers created a sophisticated facility and maintained it for 3 decades. Its planners understood that survival of the executive branch alone would leave the constitutional system incomplete. Yet the building depended upon warning times that disappeared, transportation plans never fully tested, families who could not come, and secrecy that prevented most members from preparing. Preservation should hold those truths together. The bunker matters because its machinery worked, because its larger plan might not have worked, and because the distinctions is essential. Architecture could answer questions of blast pressure, air, water, power, and physical assembly. It could not settle questions of loyalty, representation, legitimacy, or obligation to the public outside. Above ground, the spring house still expresses the first promise that nature could restore the human body. Dorothy Draper's rooms preserve the post-war promise that beauty could make a military hospital feel like a resort again. Beneath them, reinforced concrete holds a third promise, that American government could survive the destruction of its capital. What remains is not proof that any promise was complete. It is a landscape showing how generations built their hopes and fears into the same place. The Greenbrier should preserve its bunker not as a monument to perfect preparation, but as evidence of what preparation could not answer. Democratic survival requires more than keeping officials alive. It requires preserving their ability and willingness to remain connected to the people outside the door. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.